So thank you very much for everyone for being here. We have incredibly something like 260 people. That's the number of people who registered for this event. And it is, of course, the regular executive survey report by Mate UK. It's come out every year for the last decade. And the last few years have obviously been an incredibly difficult time for manufacturing. The weak sterling, declining global demand, the pandemic lockdowns affecting ports around the world, and of course, unprecedented political turmoil at home. And what this survey does is it looks ahead at the coming year, asks various leading figures across the industry what they're expecting for 2023. And again, there are incredibly strong headwinds. There are, of course, high inflation, rising interest rates, lowest level of unemployment, and a global energy crisis. But we have a great panel to discuss the report, which I'm going to summarize in a second. But we have Verity, Davidge, who is the head of policy for Mate UK. We have Cara, Haffey, who's the automotive and manufacturing leader for PwC UK. And we have Sharon, who's the managing director of T's Components. So to just dig into this report a little more before I start talking to the guests. So firstly, the impact of the increase in energy prices shows no sign of abating on manufacturers as they enter 2023. Now, in recent months, the price of energy has fallen somewhat, but that doesn't mean that things are becoming that much easier, because the price of energy is still 3, 4, 5 times what it was before the pandemic, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the survey found that 70% of manufacturing leaders said energy costs are expected to increase significantly in the coming year. And that doesn't mean only intensive energy users are finding this difficult. Rising energy costs are consuming a high proportion of business expenditure for companies across the piece. 37% of manufacturing leaders said they expect employment costs to increase significantly in the coming year. Another risk to manufacturers' competitiveness here is the increasing cost of producing goods and services. And for the first time in recent years, the survey suggests that leaders are growing increasingly concerned about domestic and international political instability, which we can discuss in more detail, because I think actually political instability might be in decline this year. And I think things might not be quite as negative as your members think on that front. And the survey also found that despite all these increasing costs, manufacturers are continuing to increase investment in the next 12 months, which may be surprising on some levels. But then the report also concludes that business confidence is being stifled by this uncertainty, by the rising costs. And 71%, the vast majority of those who were surveyed, expect economic conditions in the UK to either significantly or moderately deteriorate, and 67% expect global conditions to worsen as well. So there's probably a question there about why companies are continuing to invest if they are genuinely worried about the macroeconomic and the macro political climate. And then finally, where members asked by this survey, what should the government be doing? How can the government reboot business confidence? A lot basically said the lack of a long-term economic plan was one risk to business confidence, and also a coordinated regional approach seemed to be lacking. And we can talk, of course, about the energy bill relief scheme, which was rebooted about a week ago and is going to change from April onwards at a much lower level than before. So let's get everyone chatting. I think the first question really is, if we start with Verity, what are the main takeaways you found from this survey?
I think that when we've been speaking to manufacturers, it's, undoubtedly manufacturers are facing a very challenging time, and I'm sure Sharon can give some real life experience of that. They are operating in a post-pandemic, post-Brexit environment, and we have always seen this, creeping up of the cost of doing business, whether it's wage inflation, labour costs, input costs, but of course the biggest driver is those energy costs, as you say, Jim, in your opening remarks. 70% of businesses expect energy costs to keep on rising next year. And while we are seeing companies taking action to reduce consumption, to invest in energy efficiency, which again we might come on to later, actually those costs are coming to a point where Prices are the highest we have seen in survey history. Margins are still declining, and things aren't looking the kind of the positive picture that we would have hoped to have seen post-pandemic in terms of economic growth. So for me, that really telling point was the cost pressures, getting to a point when some companies are sadly having to really make quite difficult decisions in their businesses.
And Cara, can I ask you the same question? What do you think your main takeaway is from this report?
I think to build on what Verity said, definitely costs. I suppose if I take it to looking at the positive of what came out of the report, I think we are in a post-Brexit world now. There was a lot of Brexit discussions in last year's report, the year before. There's less in this one. So I think the businesses have kind of got used to it. Not all of them will love it, some will. But actually what's really come through this time is ESG. So people looking at the opportunity for what is the market in that greener economy and cleaner economy, but also what do they have to do themselves to get used to that environment as well in that community. So I think that's really changed over the last couple of years.
There was another point in the report that I noticed, which I hadn't mentioned before, which is that the prediction is that the UK economy in its entirety will contract by about 1.4% in the coming year. But May UK is expecting a 3.2% reduction in output for the manufacturing sector when compared to the previous year. And I wonder whether any of the panelists had any thoughts on why manufacturing will be hit 2 or 3 times harder than the rest of the economy. Is that a function of energy costs, or is it a function of something else going on there? That's a question for any of you, really.
If I kick off and then Cara and Sharon may want to add. I mean, I think obviously we always forecast year on year, so we might have had the kind of short burst of recovery post-pandemic, but it was also the shortest lived recovery that we saw for the sector. I think the other trend we are seeing is actually outputs and orders actually in decline. So previously we'd seen outputs and orders continuously to uptick, and actually it was the supply side challenges that were preventing sometimes fulfilling those orders, but we're now seeing those dip, and I think that obviously has an impact on forecasts. But as we've all, as Cara and I have already mentioned, I think it is just those extremity of costs right now that even we can say energy costs, as you mentioned, are beginning to dip, but we are nowhere near the level of cost that we were before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And actually, that's where companies are really struggling, and that's why we've had to downgrade those forecasts quite significantly.
Brilliant. So if I can bring in here Sharon Lane, who is, of course, Managing Director of T's Components, and can I ask you what your thoughts are about the report? But can I also pick you up on this, the point about Brexit not really appearing as a major concern in this report? Do you think, Sharon, that that's a reflection of companies have got used to Brexit and they're not concerned about it anymore, or just that they're kind of fatigued by the never-ending Brexit debate and just they may find life more difficult outside the EU, but they're basically cracking on and trying to proceed in the new circumstances?
Yeah, I think that the Brexit impact, it just seems to vary so widely depending on the sector that you're working in, depending on whether you particularly had a workforce that you were relying on that, relied on European labour. So I think it really just varies. So I don't think there is actually a single message from the manufacturing sector on the impact of Brexit. Verity, I don't know if you would agree with that, but certainly from our point of view, I mean, our business exports, around half of our revenue is direct export, but that's all to the US and Southeast Asia, and we don't import or export with the EU. So we've never really employed any Europeans either. So we haven't seen sort of those direct impacts as a business, but I know there are plenty of manufacturers that really have. So I think it's really varied. In terms of the messages from the report, I think that point that you mentioned, Jim, about, despite all of these different pressures, SMEs and manufacturers are still intending to invest this year. Maybe part of that is just that we've had 2 or 3 years of just pausing, and I think that there's just been such so many issues with COVID that I think lots of people are just ready to get going and just really keen to crack on. They've had lots of time to think about what they would do once things pick up again and once demand's there. So they've got all those plans ready to go, so that despite these uncertainties and despite some of the funding issues, they still really want to press on and go ahead with that, because